Is Zambia currently threatened by unsustainable debt? And how does the debt burden affect the Zambian economy as well as Zambian citizens?
Thank you very much, Jürgen, for this interview. Zambia's debt levels are still sustainable. Our debt level as a share of GDP stands between 30 and 40% of GDP. However, there are concerns that, at the rate we are accumulating debt, our debt might become unsustainable. In the last 5 years, we have accumulated over $5 billion compared to $1 billion we accumulated 5 years ago. So the rate of accumulation between 2011 and 2016 is quite high, and if we continue at this rate, our debt will become unsustainable.
What about the Zambian government? What are its development strategies, and what role does new debt play in achieving this strategy?
Well, government's strategy to develop the country, I think, rests on 4 key sectors that they have identified. They've identified mining, they've identified manufacturing, they've identified agriculture, and they've identified tourism. But we have realized that, the government has realized that infrastructure leaves much to be desired. And so they are borrowing money to invest in infrastructure to support the growth of the economy. For example, our road network is not very good to support the growing economy. Electricity supply, we have a serious deficit in the region. Road transport, we have serious deficits in this infrastructure. So government has been borrowing money to invest in this infrastructure to support the growing economy. And so that's a strategy I think that government is taking to develop the country, to use debt resources that they are borrowing. But of course, they've been concerns that some of the projects have not yielded much where government has invested money. So there's need to prioritize which project we must invest debt resources in. Otherwise, we'll have a challenge repaying these loans, especially that we are borrowing more from the open market than from bilateral or multilateral sources.
Do you think the Zambian government is doing better or worse than peers? I mean, like your neighbors. Is Zambia relatively good or relatively poor in implementing the resources?
Well, of course we are doing better than some countries, but there are other countries that are way ahead of us. And probably we want to keep up with those countries too fast. And so, speed also matters in terms of development.
Are these issues discussed among the citizenry in Zambia, or is that something that just concerns a few experts like yourself and the government?
No, Zambian people are quite concerned, even though for an ordinary Zambian, it becomes an issue when they start seeing the negative impacts, like right now. When you are borrowing, they are seeing roads, they are seeing hospitals. A lot of them are not so much concerned. I think they care less about debt as long as they can see a few things being done by government. But I think there are quite a number of us also who are concerned that in the long run this will result into serious trouble. We are already seeing government removing subsidies. Okay, so we were buying fuel at a cheaper price. We were buying electricity at a lower price. Now people are seeing the effects, of overborrowing. Government has a huge deficit. So to cover this deficit, they have to reduce their spending. And so most ordinary people, this is when they are seeing the effects of unnecessary borrowing, unnecessary spending that is not in line with your budget, which brings about unnecessary, budget deficit.
what are the major demands of the people in Zambia to their government? How to behave? What do they expect the government to do?
Well, one key demand that people in Zambia make is transparency in the way debt resources are borrowed, in the way debt resources are being spent. Because most of the time we just hear about debt after it has been contracted. And people don't like that. They want debt that is contracted transparently, debt that is debated in parliament by our representative, debt that goes to meeting project. Because if the contraction is not transparent, then even the usage is likely not to be transparent. And so that's a major ask from the Zambian people to their government. It's transparency and accountability in the way debt resources are being contracted and used.
And as you are now particularly here in Germany, do you have a sense of what a country that is in the position of Germany as being a rich country, but at the same time one of the important members of the international decision-making bodies, what if Chancellor Merkel would sit next to you, what would you tell her to do?
Interesting question. I think Germany is assuming a huge responsibility by becoming the G20 president at this time, when a number of developing countries are struggling with issues of debt. I think what we expect to see from the G20 is to have their agenda include debt issues in developing countries. The proposal that I'm making, that international institutions like international bodies like the UN, the G20 must look at the way debt for individual countries. They must look at the way of restructuring the way debt is managed at a global level. I think that's one request that we have. If Zambia, for example, today, Zambia's debt became unsustainable, and the owners of the money, the private, from the private market where we have borrowed money, demanded, is there a way of us negotiating, or it will be up to Zambia to pay back that money? That's one request that we have to G20, to the UN, and to every international partner. Secondly, we need to help developing countries mobilize domestic resources. Zambia is said to be losing about $3 billion a year through illicit financial flows. That is way above what Zambia is receiving in aid and in other channels. And so if developed countries like Germany could collaborate with the developing countries to seal the leakages of domestic resources from developing countries, I think we will go a long way in helping them reduce the debt.